Yes, when Ari first asked me to give this talk, I wanted to be provocative, and I wanted to title it something like "How I Hated Netsuke," and I think Ari thought that was a little too extreme, so we toned down the title. But I really did want to get across how my personal odyssey started with my not caring very much for Netsuke, and how I learnt to think of them in a completely different way. I realized only recently that the first Netsuke I ever saw in my life was in my own bedroom when I was 4, 5, or 6 years old. And this is, there were actually 2 Netsuke like this, very, very similar, sitting on the mantelpiece in my bedroom. And I've never discovered quite how they got there. My grandfather actually did a journey from Riga to Moscow with the Trans-Siberian Express across to Japan, and back across America. He came the long way around in 1939 after hostilities had already broken out in Eastern Europe. And I have a feeling that he bought these 2 Netsuke somewhere on his journey. And there they were on my mantelpiece. I remember them very, very well. I remember that I was struck by the imagery, by the sort of, by this ugly little man with his octopus. I was also struck by the fact that they didn't smell very nice. They had a very distinctive and odd smell, which I didn't care for at all. And, being a child, I also must have licked them, because I remember them not tasting very nice either. And as this one's lost his hand, maybe I was even responsible for biting it off. I don't remember. But anyway, they sat on my mantelpiece, and I played with them from time to time, and then I forgot about them totally. And I went off to university. I studied Russian and French. I ended up in the art world. And I actually ended up dealing with this sort of thing. I worked for Sotheby's for many years. I worked for nearly 18 years with Sotheby's, but my first incarnation there was actually dealing with Impressionist and modern paintings. So although I can't claim to have sold this one personally, this was the sort of thing I was dealing in. And then, for reasons which are far too complicated to explain, and I don't want to bore you too much today, I ended up in the early 90s getting out of Western pictures. And I was invited by Sotheby's to get involved with Japanese art. And as it was the early 90s was a sort of nadir in in world economies, and particularly in British pictures, which I happened to be selling at the time. And my business was not going very well. I had my own business by that time. And the idea of having something new to concentrate on was very, very exciting. And I'd already been to Japan in 1990 to sell pictures, and I'd been rather fascinated by it, and I loved it. And so suddenly I discovered Japanese culture, Nihon no bunka. So 1992, Sotheby's ring me and say, would you like to get involved in Japanese art? And I didn't let on to them that times were hard and that I was actually desperate for a job, but I played along, playing hard to get, and suggested to them that I should spend some time learning Japanese, the Japanese language. And they very generously agreed to pay me for a year to begin to learn Japanese. I promise you it's not that easy. It takes a lot longer than 1 year, but at least I laid the foundation. And at the end of that year, I went into Sotheby's Japanese department, and I started dealing with all sorts of things that I knew nothing about. When you work in the Japanese department of a major auction house, you're not just dealing with Netsuke, you're not just dealing with ceramics, you're dealing across the whole culture. So I was dealing with swords, with sword fittings, with armor, with ceramics, with sculpture, with metalwork, old sculpture, Meiji metalwork, Meiji art in general, prints and drawings, paintings. It's the whole gamut. And I have to say, when I first got involved with Japanese art, I was very enthusiastic about ceramics, and Nabeshima, such as this, has always struck me as extraordinary stuff. That somebody could have produced this sort of design as long ago as the 17th century strikes me as absolutely extraordinary. So that was the sort of thing that I was interested in my 10 years in the Japanese art department, Japanese department of Sotheby's. And I really spent all of those 10 years studiously avoiding getting involved with Netsuke. And there were two reasons for that. One was my perception of Netsuke, which was that they all looked like this. This is supposed to be a thumbs down, by the way. The world is absolutely full of bad Netsuke. There are many more bad Netsuke around than there are good Netsuke, which is a shame because actually there is a remarkably large number of good Netsuke around. I still manage professionally to find something that interests me in Netsuke most weeks of the year, and sometimes in some quantity. So I don't want to give the impression that all Netsuke are bad, but nonetheless, my own first impression, and therefore other people's first impression of Netsuke, may be that there's an awful lot out there that is bad. I mean, what I didn't like about them, I think, was I thought of them as small, unnecessarily intricate, sort of over-fussy. I thought that they were all about the detail rather than the sort of bigger picture, the sort of conception, the bigger conception. But what I've learnt over these last 10, 11 years is that is really not what Netsuke are about. It was my very, very good fortune to be invited after my 10 years at Sotheby's in the Japanese department to join one of the great art galleries for Japanese art in the world, Sydney Moss, which is now over 100 years old. It's already in its fourth generation, but I was invited by Paul Moss, the grandson of the founder, to join him. And this came about because Sotheby's themselves, rather foolishly, decided to get out of Japanese art, so I was in danger of losing my job. And that got me into a long discussion with Sydney Moss. And after 2 years of courting, Paul finally persuaded me to go and work with him. And I don't think I really understood what I was getting myself in for. I thought when I went to work for Sydney Moss, all I would be doing was working with the same sort of Japanese art that I'd worked with at Sotheby's. Well, not a bit of it. They are London's oldest Asian art gallery, and they do both Chinese and Japanese art. But when it comes to Japanese art, they do mostly Netsuke and lacquer. And I suddenly found, I need to go backtrack a bit. The other reason that I didn't really get involved with Netsuke at Sotheby's was that I worked alongside Neil Davey, who is one of the people who has worked in Netsuke the longest of anyone in the world. He joined Sotheby's when he was 16 years old, and he had the good fortune to be in place when the great Mark Heinzen sold his collection of Netsuke in, 6 or 7 parts in the late 1960s, over a couple of years. So Neil got to deal with the hundreds of Netsuke, very, very good Netsuke from the Heinzen collection, and eventually published them in a very useful book. I think it's now a book that's become slightly surpassed by more recent publications, but for many years it was really one of the great standard works. It's still an important work, not least because of the importance of the Heinzen collection. But I was working along Neil in the 1990s, over 30 years after. Actually, we celebrated when I was there. We celebrated his 40 years at Sotheby's, and he had dealt with Netsuke throughout that time, and therefore there was little reason for me in a small department to get involved with Netsuke when I had the great man sitting next to me. But when I went to work with Paul, things changed. I suddenly found at Sydney Moss that I had to take an interest in Netsuke, and not only did I find that I had to take an interest in Netsuke, but because I was suddenly dealing with Netsuke almost exclusively of fine quality, I began to appreciate what they were about. Now, before I came here this afternoon, I had no idea what your knowledge of Netsuke is, so forgive me if I cover ground that some of you already know, but I'm going to slightly assume the lowest common denominator. And in taking you through a short journey on Netsuke, I need to explain to you what they're about. A Netsuke is really, it's a stopper, if you like. It's a toggle that hangs over the belt, and it stops the Japanese, and particularly Japanese men, but women also, like to carry things from their belt. Now, it's commonly said that the reason sagemono, literally anything which sagemono, the word sagemono means hanging thing. And the Japanese like these hanging things, but it's often said that Japanese have sagemono because the kimono has no pockets, Well, it's true that the kimono has no pockets, but my friend Princess Takamado would love me to explain to everyone who ever hears this myth that it's not because they didn't have pockets. Actually, even without pockets, there are many ways of secreting things about the kimono. Not least, you've actually got the way the sleeves are sewn. It's perfectly possible to put things in the sleeve and carry them in the sleeve. Also, particularly with women, because the obi, the belt, is worn quite high, you will frequently see women today when they're wearing okimono in Japan who have quite a lot of things tucked into the top part of their kimono because it's actually held in place quite comfortably. That functions as a pocket. Men, it's not quite so simple as that because actually they're wearing, traditionally Japanese man wears his belt much lower. In fact, the typical thing, I've worn a kimono myself, and the typical thing is for a man to be a little bit proud of his stomach. So he has his stomach here, and often the obi is here. But it doesn't mean, you can still tuck things in there and they will sit there quite happily. So this thing about the kimono not having pockets is a little bit of an urban myth. But I think the fact is that the Japanese liked sagemono. I mean, they are, in times of sumptuary laws where sort of conspicuous wealth was a little bit frowned on, clothing was often quite simple. It was your one way of expressing your style. And I think that if you were a wealthy townsman, you would go out with your mates and you would sit down having a drink or a meal or whatever, and the first thing I'm sure they did was to all take off their sagemono and they'd start passing them around. There was a little bit of showing off involved and a little bit of showing off your good taste as well. And I think that is quite an important part of what this is about. Now, so there you've got the classic, simple Inro. You've got a pretty simple manju netsuke, or actually quite an elaborate manju netsuke, but a manju netsuke, a bun-shaped netsuke which hangs over your obi. You've got the little ojime which helps to keep the thing closed, and you've got an Inro, the function of which, more often than not, I mean, they sometimes say that people carried snacks around in them. If they did, they were very small snacks because an Inro is not very big. But principally, they carried medicines. And if my wife is anything to judge by, my Japanese wife is anything to judge by, she is a hypochondriac. I've never seen so many pills and powders in my life. And I think that, the Japanese have long liked pills and powders. And so having the little box that you could carry around with 5 or 6 different medicaments about your person was quite a useful thing. Now, I don't know whether anyone's done a study on this, but I'm quite interested in the sort of history of how these things were worn. It seems to me, this is what I'm showing you now is one leaf from an album in the British Museum. It's a 17th century album, so 17th century paintings, and it shows a very much more elaborate set of sagemono, or things attached to or hanging from the belt, than what I've just shown you previously. Sort of trying to deconstruct it, my interpretation is that the netsuke here is the gourd-shaped, the white gourd-shaped thing towards the top. But it's then attached along the way to a seal, and it's quite, you understand why somebody would want to have a seal. I mean, to this day, the Japanese use seals quite importantly. Quite often you sign a check in Japan with a seal, with your hanko, and not with your signature. So seals have been important for a long time. There's a pouch there, a cloth pouch, which, I mean, it could have contained anything, but let's assume for the moment that it's a money pouch. And, of course, an Inro. Now, I think that this was, given the date of this painting from quite early in the 17th century, I think that this sort of elaborate configuration, I mean, I can't remember how many sheets there are in this album, but it's at least 10 from memory, and each one is of a very, very elaborate combination like this. I'm sorry not to have more to show you. This is a box that we had when I was at Sydney Moss. I actually bought and sold this box. It's not particularly early. It's signed by Kanshosai. It's probably early 19th century. But here again you see, on the side of the box, you see one Inro, with a pouch, and they're in fact joined to one Netsuke around the corner, simple one of maple leaves. And I think that this, it may not, well actually it's interesting that on this box you've got the two styles of wearing an Inro, because on top you've got the simpler version with simply the Netsuke, the ojime, and the Inro. But I think that this, my suspicion is that this thing of attaching two or more sagemono to the Netsuke was possibly quite a common thing throughout the 17th and maybe through quite a lot of the 18th century as well. By the 19th century I suspect it had been given up, but it's something I would like to do more work on myself. This is a late 18th century Netsuke, which I had a short while ago for sale. It's by Hidemasa. It's from the early, well, it's probably around 1800 in date, but here we have in Netsuke form an illustration of the same thing. You see you've got the same sort of pouch, small Inro, a classic Kyoto style Netsuke of an ox, and you'll see there's an ojime on both sides, so each of the Inro and the pouch each has its own ojime to keep it closed. But it's quite interesting to see that in just another iconographic demonstration of this style of wearing. I won't bang on about Inro for too long because this is supposed to be a talk about Netsuke, but another aspect of them which interests me is that we know with some certainty that Inro were adopted very, very early in the 17th century. They probably existed already by the end of the 1500s. The earliest datable Inro is this one here. I'm sorry it's such a bad illustration, but that's the only one I can find so far of it. But this particular Inro was buried with this man Date Masamune in 1636. So we know for certain that Inro existed by that date, and judging by the style of it, which is rather different from the previous slide, my assumption and the assumption of most people who take an interest in Inro is that this particular style of Inro was about the earliest. But it's sort of fairly typical to have, I mean, when it was first made, all the black chrysanthemum flowers there would in fact have been high relief takamakie, high relief pictorial lacquer. It looks the way it does now because, of course, the top surface has been rubbed away with centuries of use. But they're very attractive things and really not even very expensive to buy. You can still find these for hundreds of euros rather than thousands. The curious thing is that we know, as I say, that Inro were already around in the early 17th century, probably as early 1600 or a bit before. But nobody dares very much to date Netsuke before about 1700. I think that may be in part because the very first Netsuke may have been very, very simple objects. I mean, they may almost have been objets trouvés, pleasing. The Japanese like materials, and I think that they probably appreciated a well-formed piece of stone, or simple pieces of stag antler, or bone, or coral, any other exotic material that came their way. If it had a pleasing shape and if it served to hold the Inro or other sagemono in place, it served as a Netsuke. And it may be that not many of those have survived because they were superseded by what came later in Netsuke. But it's generally assumed that the first katabori Netsuke, the first sculptural Netsuke, if you like, were things of this type. This is a type known as tobori. It's almost certainly copied from a Chinese original, copied from a Ming ivory. There is some debate whether some of the tobori Netsuke are not actually Chinese. I happen to describe, it's a matter of, be difficult to convince you one way or the other, but I think they're Japanese. But knowing the Japanese reverence for things which came from China, I don't see it as, actually I think it's quite likely that that Chinese toggles could have been adopted in Japan for use as Netsuke. And indeed, it's quite possible that Ming carvings of this type were used as Netsuke. But I think fairly soon on, the Japanese started copying them themselves. This one, I think, has all the craquelure that you see there simply through age and the nature of this particular piece of ivory, though quite often Chinese ivories seem to become much more crackled than the Japanese ones. I have no idea why that is, but in some ways, while I believe that is Japanese, it's done in all its crackling, it has some of the characteristics of a Chinese carving. Another early type was almost certainly, I'm sorry I don't have any illustrations of paintings, but the word kuruma literally means wheel in Japanese. I think these may have been adapted. They were. Oh, this is one obviously that's been carved as a dragon. Quite often they are simple discs of or rings of ivory. They may well have come from priests' robes. I don't know whether you're familiar with Japanese priest robes, but they often have an ivory disc here which serves to close the robe. And again, I'm sorry not to have an illustration of that. This is an adaptation of that. Now, I don't think that when these were worn as Netsuke that they were necessarily, I don't think the obi necessarily went through it, though it would be perfectly possible. A man's obi is much thinner, it's narrower. Woman's obi is normally about that height, whereas a man's one is like that. So a male obi would easily thread through that, but I think actually what you did was to just pull it up through your obi and then have things attached to it. But this was one style early on in the 18th century, and because they were just plain discs, that may explain why they haven't survived in great number, because subsequently they would have struck people as being rather ordinary and of no consequence. But you do find them from time to time, not as often as you would think. Another style, this is actually a much later Netsuke by an artist I admire greatly, and I'm sorry, well, I suppose the quality is not too bad. This is a big thing. I mean, that is about that size. And just as I was saying that originally I think that the earliest Netsuke were possibly objets trouvés, they were also, there's a tradition of turning in Japan. If you know what I mean by turning, it's, when you use a lathe to cut circular shaped objects. And so to turn a piece of ivory, a simple piece of ivory, and make either what they call a manju, a bun-shaped Netsuke, which you do see quite often, or from time to time, in 17th century paintings and prints. So I think there was a tradition of turning, and of course the Japanese adopted smoking fairly early on. They loved tobacco, and quite often they wore Netsuke which also functioned as ashtrays. So that would explain this sort of shape. I mean, you could hold that and tap out your pipe and make sure that your lighted tobacco didn't fall on the tatami mat, which would be slightly disastrous. Here's another of these early katabori, tabori types. Once they get into carving sculpturally, which seems to have taken off in the 18th century, as I say, we have no dated Netsuke to really hang the whole dating of Netsuke onto. I'll come on to, there is a key date later in the 18th century, but already by then Netsuke are quite, sculptural Netsuke are quite developed. But I think just through guesswork and by comparison, people who follow Netsuke have a sort of, each of us ends up with our own sort of dating. I have a feeling that we probably need to take the dating of those early tabori Netsuke back into the 17th century, because I cannot believe that there's 100 years without sculptural Netsuke in any significant numbers. So sooner or later, we probably have to come to terms with that. Nonetheless, the earlier Netsuke tend to take their subjects from China, Chinese subjects, Chinese mythology. This chap is absolutely huge. This is one I sold a year ago. He's deceptively large. He's that sort of size, and really, really, really substantial. And he's one of the bigger tall Netsukes that I have. There's a curious diversion. There is a body of opinion. There are people in Japan who are convinced that the tall Netsuke, which I'm about to show you in the next few slides, are a Meiji fiction. They are convinced that all of these Netsuke were made in the late 19th century to deceive foreigners in their enthusiasm for things Japanese. I'm afraid I don't subscribe to that view at all. I think that there is something about the feel of an 18th century Netsuke in terms of the patina, the wear. It couldn't be anything else but 18th century. So I'm taking it as given that all these ones I'm about to show you are indeed 18th century. This is one that I had recently, less substantial than the other one. This is a sennin, a mountain hermit. They're always distinguishable by usually their skirts or their cloaks made of mugwort leaves. And there's a whole iconography of sennin. You can recognize the different sennin by their attributes. This is the peach sennin. No, it's not. He's carrying a peony. I'm not sure which sennin he is, actually. This is a beautiful, early-ish 18th century Netsuke. And actually, very interestingly, I can't show it to you in a slide. It was so beautifully, the mouth was so beautifully hollowed out that actually the light was coming through the head. And when you looked into the mouth, there was actually a glow in the mouth from the light. It was quite extraordinary bit of carving. This is another sennin. This is by great late 18th century artist Tsuji. Really quite small. I mean, we're going from things about that big to something really very tiny and delicate. This particular sennin, Tekai, blows out his soul, and quite often he's depicted. There's a wonderful depiction in a Yoshinaga Netsuke, which I've handled before, where he's lying down and he's blowing out his soul, and you can see the soul is sort of almost like a gush of water which goes over his shoulder, and then his little soul is a pilgrim sort of walking off into the distance on this. And here, the breath has a physical presence. This little strand going up to his hand, and his soul is just a little homunculus disappearing up into space. This is probably a depiction of Shoki on the left, the demon queller, but his appearance and his clothes are supposed to be exotic, foreign, Chinese, strange. A lot of attention going to the detail of his clothing, which is not in the least bit Japanese. Chinese mythological beings are obviously quite important. They're adopted on a regular basis. This is a dragon fish, conjoined dragons. This is sort of slightly out of date sequence, but it's quite nice to see the Japanese adopting a very old Chinese theme. This is of course a carp jumping a waterfall, but it has much greater significance in Chinese and Japanese cultures than the simple act. It's not just a depiction from nature, if you like. This story is associated with the taking of the equivalent of civil service exams in China, in ancient China, and you had this great waterfall to surmount in taking these exams, and if you passed, then you were quite often given a painting or something with this sort of imagery. What you can't see in this slide, it's very nice if you turn this Netsuke to one side. It's actually pierced on both sides. You can see inside, and on the inside is a little carp falling down. So this is the one that's failed. So the meaning is there that it's not everyone who manages to succeed in these exams. And the Japanese Netsuke carvers love this sort of trickery, if you like, because there's no way the artist wants us to believe that he's carved this little carp on the inside from the outside, but not a bit of it. In fact, I've seen a number of these, and they don't always have the carp inside. They've lost them along the way. But what he actually did was he cut a section off the top. He carved the little carp separately, he put it inside, probably stuck it inside, and then he put the top back on, but carefully made sure that the join couldn't be seen, so that you think he's done this clever bit of carving. Very Japanese. While I've got his name up there, I should say the name Masanao is a little bit confusing. I'm going to come on later to the great Masanao, the 18th century carver Masanao of Kyoto. But there is another family of Masanao carvers in a different area of Japan, in Yamada Ise. They're very good carvers, but they're a long dynasty. I mean, they started in the mid-19th century, and there's a carver, there's a descendant of the family still carving today. Competent carvers, but doing something different from Masanao of Kyoto, as you will see. Also, I should perhaps say that the concept of a family of carvers, or family of any sort of artisan in Japan, is quite an interesting one, because it's not necessarily the case that although you have these lines of makers passing from master to apprentice over several generations, it's not necessarily strictly family. It's quite possible for a good master to find that his son doesn't meet his exacting standards, and therefore he invites a boy in from somewhere else, a boy who has more talent than his own son, and if that talent is realized, it's that adopted son who takes the name. So when we talk of families, it's used in a slightly loose term, but it's a very good way of ensuring that the quality of craftsmanship passes down over several generations. So the Japanese in the early Netsuke carvers enjoyed subjects. This is a creature called a karyobinga, which is sort of part human, part birds. They like these creatures which are half human, or part human, part animal. This is probably adopted from India, with Buddhism. But beautiful 18th century carving, actually very Chinese sort of headdress. But it becomes confused. A lot of these mythical, legendary creatures become confused in the Japanese mind. That, as you can see, there are quite a lot of similarities. In fact, it's quite probably a carver of this Netsuke who went on to carve this Netsuke, and it's sort of confused imagery. What we have here is, in fact, a Tengu, who is half man, half bird, a mountain-dwelling warrior. But as I say, it's probably from the same group of carvers. And I suspect even that this mermaid is from a similar stable of carvers as well. So you've got sort of the half fish and the half bird all being grouped together. But they at this time they love these weird, inexplicable creatures. They also adopt straight mythical animals from China. This is slightly feeble slide. I'm sorry. It's that is probably by Tomotada, one of the great 18th century carvers from Kyoto. Pretty successful Kilin, chimera. A lot of these creatures, even some of the best of them, are a little bit stiff. They have a bit of a problem with the front legs. They often end up being a little bit straight and rigid. This is more successful because he's managed to, well, you can see the leg behind is still a little bit straight and stiff, but the artist has managed to introduce some movement into that left leg, and nice serpentine shape to the body. This is another favourite of theirs, a baku, which is a sort of slightly elephant-like creature. It has the trunk of an elephant, but as you can see, it's got things in common with you see it's got a similar sort of tail. A lot of these legendary beasts end up with things in common. So you can see these two creatures have the same sort of tail, and do you see the sort of bobbly effect, almost like cellulite, particularly on the hind leg, but also, I mean, you've got vertebrae being expressed there, but this back leg, you've got these sort of fatty elements. You sometimes see those. It's not present in this particular kirin, but you quite often get that on the legs of the kirin as well. but you note that the body here is covered in scales, and it's got a neck almost like a snake or an alligator. Baku have the great quality of swallowing dreams. So I think they swallow both bad and good dreams, but quite often Japanese pillows had an image of a Baku at either end to bring good sleep. There are a couple more impressive Baku. But you find elephants in Netsuke as well. I don't think I've got photos of any today, but really the distinguishing features is that an elephant would not have these wonderful bushy tails and manes. But clearly when you get to the trunk, it's hard to distinguish the two. And also, you see these flames that are coming, you sort of have flames emanating at the neck and the hind leg. You get those on kirin, there they are, and quite often on Baku, though, well, you got on that Baku, but not on these. So the artists themselves are sometimes a little bit confused by the iconography. Here are three more weird Japanese creatures. Here we're beginning to get away from the Chinese and more into the native Japanese mythical creatures. The one on the right is Tenjin Sanjin, sort of mountain-living creature, again with scaly skin and a tail that comes between his legs, and slightly humanoid head. The middle one is a Tengu. This particular Tengu seems to be more bird than man. And on the left you've got a kappa, a water-living creature, more normally shown hugging a cucumber. They love cucumbers, and that's how they're normally shown, but here he is hugging a fish. The kappa has its vital fluids in a sort of open pool on its head, and they're very vicious creatures, but also very polite. And supposedly, if you're attacked by a kappa, the thing to do is to bow, because they feel bound to bow back, and in so doing, the vital fluid pours out of the recipient on their head, and they can't do their evil anymore. And that's another Tengu. This is a very popular subject of Netsuke. This is the hatching Tengu. And again, he's more, in this particular instance, he's more bird than man, I would say. That's by Toyomasa, who's one of the great Toyomasa the first, Toyomasa the second. This is probably Toyomasa the second, but he's one of the great carvers of Tamba. More exoticism. Because the Japanese didn't get to see too many foreigners, as you probably know, after a short spell, the Portuguese were banned from Japan entirely at the end of the 17th century, and the Dutch, although they were allowed to stay on, were restricted to the island of Deshima, and the Chinese to a neighbouring island just off Nagasaki, which meant that most Japanese did not get to see foreigners, and it meant that foreigners were of great speculative interest. They were as exotic as all these strange creatures depicted in the Chinese tradition. Sometimes, because the carvers themselves didn't know firsthand what they were carving, there seems to be sort of iconographic confusion. But my guess would be, particularly judging from the clothes, that most of these three are meant to be Chinese. Certainly, the dress is pretty Chinese, though having said that, the long coat worn by the chap in the centre has these wave motifs along the bottom, and quite often Dutchmen, I can't remember whether I've got any slides of Dutchmen, but Dutchmen were depicted quite often, and they frequently wore long coats which you would recognise as European coats, frock coats, but frequently with these sort of wave motifs over the bottom, and I think that's because they associated the Dutch with the sea, and so they were probably meant to be sea captains or whatever. But I think judging from that the style of that long coat and the hat, that is meant to be a Chinese. But sometimes you're left in doubt. This chap on the right is clearly derived from a Dutchman. I think you can see that's much more of a much more of a, well, even that coat I think is a bit of a hybrid. He's meant to be a monkey trainer, but he's got the hair or wig of a Dutchman, so that's probably a bit of a hybrid. I mean, most the monkey trainers normally were native Japanese, though the Dutchmen were quite frequently, when you see a depiction of a Dutchman, it's carrying an animal of some sort, either a dog over his shoulders, sometimes a boar, a hare, or quite often carrying a cockerel or a crane. It's thought that the reason they're shown carrying cranes is that the Dutch frequently travelled with cassowaries, big birds on their boats, and that because the Japanese themselves didn't understand what a cassowary was, they depicted the only thing they knew which was similar, which would have been a crane. And the chap on the left, I have to say, I don't know quite what nationality he's supposed to be. He's perhaps not even a foreigner. He may just be a performer of some sort, but there you are. This chap is another foreigner, probably a sort of confused one at that. I mean, he's got sort of lank European type hair, but his dress is very, very Chinese in spirit, quite what he's meant to be. I don't know. He could even be a South Sea Islander of sorts, but you know, when it came to depicting foreigners, accuracy was not what it was about. It was conveying the idea of exoticism. The Japanese also liked to have their erotic fantasy in Netsuke. This is probably carved in Japan, though it's clearly derived from a Chinese doctor's model. I have seen Chinese doctor's models which have been adapted for use as Netsuke. In other words, they have had some sort of attachment. The one I particularly remember had a silver loop attached to the back to make it into a Netsuke, but it had started its life as a Chinese doctor's model. This one, I suspect, it's a bit too, dare I say, it's a bit too sexy to have been carved in China, to my eyes. I think this is carved in Japan, but following the idea of a doctor's model. So it's an adaptation. These are diving girls, ama, who traditionally, I mean, actually even in the 20th century, perhaps even today, always dived bare-breasted, and so they're the sort of stuff of erotic fantasy. And quite often they are depicted in Netsuke as having a bit of a struggle with an octopus. The octopus seems to be a sort of thing of Japanese erotic fantasy. Some of you may be familiar with the great hokusai of the octopus ravishing a woman. But in Netsuke you see this quite often, and where are those tentacles? Oni are demons, but they're not really the devils. They're not normally, certainly in Netsuke, they're rarely the devils of Western religious iconography. They're a sort of, they're more mischievous than malign. So here you see one hiding behind a very severe mask, but you can see that behind that mask he's got a slightly sheepish expression. Not at all, he's not quite as fierce or as menacing as he would have us believe. And you know, I think these are really docile pussy cats of demons. They're not the stuff of nightmares. They're sort of bored. They looked, well, the one in the middle looks bored. The one on the left and the one on the right both look a bit frightened themselves. So they've got demons to scare them. Those are all 18th century again. Three more again. I don't think they're going to pose us with any threat or give us any trouble. Now, I was talking about dating, and there's only one major publication which helps us with, in some way or in any way, with the dating of Netsuke, and this is the sorry, it's actually, I've put Soshen Kiko, it's the Soken Kisho, I beg your pardon, published in 1781 in Osaka, which is little more than a list of known carvers of the time, carvers of reputation, with a few comments about what they carved, and in some cases some line drawings giving some subject of those particular carvers. Although this is not signed, this is a huge piece again. Some people think it's an okimono, in other words, a sculpture rather than a Netsuke. But I'll show you the back in a second. But that was that big and really quite bulky. Although it's not signed, I did attribute it to Sanko, who is one of the artists listed in the Soken Kisho. There's the back of it. You can see that it does have holes which function as himatoshi for attaching cords, but whether or not it's open to debate. But that is probably a Netsuke of the type that one can date to 1780 or before. I mean, probably 1750 to 1780. Another of the carvers listed in Soken Kisho is Tomotada, who is one of the great, particularly animal carvers of the late 18th century. While Kyoto is associated with realistic animals, I think it would be mistaken to pretend that this is a realistic representation of horse, but it's a very graceful conception of a horse. But Tomotada is he's one of the most copied artists of the 18th century. That signature is one that one sees frequently, particularly on oxen, and a lot of the Netsuke which carry his name are not probably by him, but that is thought to be by him. That is a goat by him, and again I would argue that that it's not necessarily a naturalistic representation. It's more, it's a slightly, it's rather a sweet creature with a bit of a smile to it. There's the signature again. This is another of the great carvers listed in the Soken Kisho. This is Masanao of Kyoto, another hatching tengu, but that's one of the absolute classics of the 18th century of that subject. That's what his signature looks like, much copied. Quite interesting. I mean, one could go on at length about the way these himatoshi, these holes, are carved, but one of the features of Masanao is that he nearly always has, it's an 18th century feature to have a smaller and larger hole, but his are always one small round and one large oval, and then deeply, deeply excavated inside, so you can get a large knot in there if you need to. This is Okatomo, who is one of the pupils of Tomotada, and I think here you can see already that one's moving away from the sort of slightly stylized towards the more naturalistic representation. That's a beautiful representation of a dog. That's Masanao again, wonderful rat with these great eyes and inlaid horn. And that is a pupil of, that's a follower of Tomotada, that's Okatori. I think that's absolutely wonderful naturalism. I mean, there you're really getting very sensitive representation of reality and animals. That's Masanao again with a horse. Same features. You can actually get a sense of how deeply excavated that himatoshi is there. And I think one of the features of the great 18th century carvers, particularly these recumbent animals, a good Masanao, a good Tomotada, is not just flat on the bottom. It's not just that the legs are nicely carved, but also there's a roundness, there's curvature in all directions to the underside, whereas the poorer copies tend to be very flat on the underneath. I think it's a good sign of whether it's a good 18th century carving. That is the most famous Netsuke in the world currently. That's the Masatoshi Hare with Amber Eyes, the subject of Edmund de Waal's book. Of course, the Japanese have a bit of a problem when it comes to representing a real animal, but a real animal which they haven't seen. They don't know tigers. They only know tigers from representations in paintings. And so they end up being more the idea of a tiger than the real representation of a tiger. And I think this brings me to a feature of Japanese art, which is that they quite like to cartoonize. So if you don't know a tiger, what do you do with it? You make it into a figure of fun. And I think you can see that these are all slightly humorous approaches. These are more pussycats than fierce tigers. I mean, the one on the right is trying to be fierce, but somehow he's not entirely convincing with it. And there you have Shishi doing much the same thing. 18th century dog, the same thing. This is more Disney than real dog. A toad, it's sort of, yes, it's a good representation of a toad, but at the same time there's something going on with that mouth which makes it a little closer to cartoon and manga. You've got an element of humour being introduced to it here with, this is one of the great Hida Takayama carvers, Tsukenaga, and wonderful, in some ways, wonderful realistic representation of all the warts and skin of toads, but then the humour with this leg which is pressing down on the eye of the toad below, which is therefore having to close the eye, whereas the other one on the other side is wide open. These shishi are, again, a bit like the oni. They're not fierce. They're sort of pussycat shishi. They're not going to frighten anyone. Humour is quite a big element of Japanese art. This is Okame, who's a figure of fun. She represents, she's not a beauty. She's a bit of an ugly woman, but she likes life and she likes sex, and she sees sex in everything, not least in mushrooms. So she always gets excited when she sees a long-nosed mask or a mushroom. These temple guardians, Neo, have been brought out of their sentry boxes and are having an arm wrestling match. So nice bit of fantasy and humour and imagination all rolled into one. Rare artist Higo Daijo. Here you have two representations of Daruma, the patriarch, Buddhist patriarch, meditating for 9 years, looking very unhappy on the right, enveloped in his robe, and on the left I think he must be coming out of his meditation, and he looks like somebody with a bad hangover. And chap in the middle is one of the lucky gods, Fukurokuju, good, friendly sort of fellow. That's Hote, Putai from China. Again, lucky god, and he's represented as a well-fed, over-fat, fatty chap. The macabre is another element that the Japanese like. Severed head, pretty. Ari, how much longer do I have?
Well, the other conference just arrived. So yes.
5 minutes?
You can go on 3 hours.
5 minutes, okay. Well, I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. Sorry, I could have shown you a lot more. If anyone would like to stay behind and go somewhere, I'm happy to run through these on the screen, and I can show you more. But in all events, I hope that I've given you a taste for what's good in Netsuke. I have with me the catalogue of an exhibition that my business partner, Rosemary Bandini, has curated in the Embassy of Japan in London, which is one of the greatest assemblage of Netsukes from private collections seen together in a long, long time. So if anyone would like to see that, do come and see me. And I'll be happy to, as I say, to talk about Netsuke with anyone who wants to, or to show you more on my computer. Yeah? Thank you very much for your attention.